today. And thanks to our Assistant Dean, Anya Schmemann, for putting an event on Ukraine together on very short notice. Hopefully, as things happen in the world, we will do more of these in a timely manner so that we can take advantage of the experts that we have here to understand big, important events, and in this case, events that seem to be changing dramatically. I keep checking my phone so that I won't be completely out of the loop as the moderator of this discussion. I'm Jim Goldgeier. I'm Dean of the School of International Service. And it's really a great pleasure to have two of our American University faculty members here to help us understand what is going on as we have seen a government deal with a series of protests, escalating violence. The president leaves his position. Parliament takes action. We see dueling protests in Crimea, mass gunmen taking over buildings today. And I think it's important for us to sort out what all these different issues are and to think about how things might or might not move forward in a peaceful and collaborative manner in Ukraine. And of course, there's also the interest of other countries in the region. The European Union has a strong interest in what's going on in Ukraine. Russia has a strong interest in what's going on in Ukraine. The United States, although far away, has had a very strong interest since Ukrainian independence in 1991 in the future of Ukraine. So I'm joined here today by Keith Darden, who is a professor here in the School of International Service and just joined the faculty here in the fall and works on issues across Eurasia, has a big book coming out from Cambridge University Press. I didn't mean big as in big, but big as in important. On resisting occupation in Eurasia, I believe, is the name of the book, and follows an earlier book that he did a few years ago, Economic Liberalism, that won him all sorts of praise and admiration. And someone who's been here a little longer is Anton Fedyashin, who's a faculty member in the history department here at American University and directs the Initiative for Russian Culture, which has been an extraordinarily successful initiative to build up work on Russia, film series, and a whole series of other events, conferences. It's really been quite dramatic, the work that Anton and his colleagues, Eric Lohr and others, have been able to do to really make American University a place that has more going on Russia than any place else in Washington, D.C. Can I say that? I'm going to say that.
You can say that.
All right. Keith, I'm going to start with you. We hear a lot about everybody in Western Ukraine wants to join Europe. Everybody in Eastern Ukraine wants to join Russia. There are these divisions that people have a hard time understanding who's who within the country. And if you could just explain to us first, who are the Ukrainians? What is the makeup of the population and the roots of the kinds of things we're seeing as we look at the population? And answer the question, why wouldn't everyone in Ukraine want closer relations with the EU? And why wouldn't everyone in Ukraine want Ukraine to have a good relationship with Russia?
Good luck, my friend.
Okay, so I have the next hour to discuss this, I hope. So, to your first question, who are the Ukrainians? Part of that is
Good luck on that.
part of it is, how did we get Ukraine, which is a fairly recent political construction. It's about 20 years old, and prior to that, the pieces of what are now Ukrainian territory are the remnants of a lot of other empires, and in many ways, the divisions that we see currently in Ukraine are the legacies of those empires. So it's an oversimplification to say that the center and west are pro-Europe and the south and the east are pro-Russian. But it's not an egregious oversimplification. In other words, to a great extent, that's actually true. And that's in large part because the areas to the south and east were, much like the American West, settled during the Russian Empire. They were acquired from the Ottoman Empire. And so you have a movement of people into those areas. They're settled in the 18th and 19th century. And those people are largely, although ethnically Ukrainian, very closely tied to Russian culture, and also a very substantial number of ethnic Russians in that area. That's true most of all for Crimea, which has been the reason why we've seen the events in Crimea in the last 24 to 48 hours. Crimea was in fact not incorporated into Ukraine until it was part of Soviet Ukraine as a gift from Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. And so that population is very strongly identified with Russia. Over a majority are ethnically Russian. And you also have the areas in the far west, which actually provided most of the shock troops that you saw on the Maidan in Kiev, which were part of the Habsburg Empire. And in the 19th century, the people in those areas were taught that they were Ukrainians and that they were very different from Russians and Poles, who were their historic enemies. And there is a strong legacy in those areas of a particular brand of Ukrainian nationalism, which leads those areas to be very antagonistic towards Moscow. The center can go one way or the other. In the early 90s, they were pro-communist and pro-Soviet. Now they've been voting with Tymoshenko, Batkivshina, her bloc. And so there's some mixture in the middle. But this southern and eastern belt, including the strongholds of Yanukovych in the east, but also the south all the way over to Odessa, which are quite far west, are very pro-Russian. And I think that those have been with us for quite a long period of time. They're not likely to change those affiliations. The question is, how do you manage them? Right? And this gets at your second question. Is, why don't these people want to join Europe? Europe is a very nice place to live. Southern and eastern Ukraine, not such great places to live. Governance is corrupt for the most part. The leadership is not loved. There's a fusion of wealth and power that is inseparable throughout all of Ukraine, that you actually have to hold power in order to hold wealth because there's no guarantee for your property other than having control of the courts. And so you would think that everybody would want to get rid of this. And for the most part, that's correct. The problem is they don't necessarily want to get rid of it by joining Europe. And I think that they separate the issue of governance and they separate the issue of corruption from the geopolitical orientation of the country. And so there doesn't have to be a move away from Russia in order to get better governance. And I think that if the country is going to remain whole, that's likely the path that's going to keep it whole. This government's going to focus on rooting out corruption and improving governance and not so much on its anti-Russian rhetoric and trying to move the country towards the West.
And just one follow-up, and then I want to turn to Anton. When we look back at the referendum of December 1991, in which the Ukrainian people voted for independence from the Soviet Union, many people who supported the idea of Ukrainian independence were pleased that every region of Ukraine voted for that independence. It may have been higher in some places than in others, but even in Crimea, there was support for the independence of Ukraine from Moscow. Has something changed in the last 2 decades that would lead more of that population to think differently than they did back in December of 1991?
It's interesting because in March of 1991, there was also a referendum on whether the Soviet Union should continue to exist. And we see a very similar, basically in that referendum, it's only these western areas that were once part of the Austrian portion of the Habsburg Empire that voted to reject the Soviet Union. And shortly after that, the independence referendum, we saw a similar voting pattern where there was not a lot of support, and public opinion polls have shown that there was not a lot of support for moving away from Russia. So part of the argument about what happened in 1991 was that the Communist Party actually issued a directive down to say, look, vote for the independence referendum because we're very worried about what's going on in Moscow and we want to keep our party privileges here. And so it's not necessarily the case that there was a sort of a nationalist consensus at that time that has since broken down. There's something very odd actually about that referendum, and it goes against what we see are some very strong historical patterns of division in the country that continue to persist.
And Anton, with respect to Russia and also Russia's relationship with Russian speakers in Ukraine, on the former, there's been a lot of concern in recent days, people talking about Georgia 2008 and the Russian move there, and would Russia intervene, and Russia had military readiness tests that were announced yesterday that Foreign Minister Lavrov told Secretary Kerry today that those were scheduled, long-standing tests had been scheduled for a long time. It was just a coincidence that they came up during this particular crisis. The foreign minister also did pledge that Russia would not intervene militarily in this situation, but we've also seen the deposed president call for Russian support. And can you explain to us both how the Russians see their interests, how the Russian government has or hasn't related to the Russian speakers in Ukraine in terms of formal types of ties with them? And after we've done with that, I want to ask both of you to comment on why Yanukovych just said, I'm out of here, and tried to regroup somewhere else. But we'll start with the Russian.
Well, let's start with the Russian interest in Ukraine, which is first and foremost, of course, economic, as far as the Putin government is concerned. There's been a lot of talk in the Western press about the imminent danger of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, despite the fact that many Russian officials, except for Putin, by the way, have made it blatantly clear that Russia has no plans to move into Ukraine. I suppose that talking about red lines is important, and one of them may be an open attack on the Russian Black Sea Fleet by forces, in which case the army, or rather the navy, in Sevastopol would mobilize to defend itself. But other than that, I don't really see any reasons for the Russians moving in. First of all, a united Ukraine is in Russia's best interest, as any stable region is on one of your longest European borders. Second of all, Ukraine is still a transit country for Russian gas, and if there's anything that the Russian government prides itself on and is very concerned about, it's the reliability of its supplies to Europe. And, of course, the payments that it gets in return. So Ukraine imploding into civil war will wreak such havoc on Russian economic interests and its reliability vis-a-vis the European countries that it supplies, plus Ukraine itself, of course, that I don't really see any economic benefits to Russia invading, as opposed to, of course, sending signals. And I think that the exercises and the mobilization is a signal that is sent specifically to the more radical groups that are on Maidan and in Ukraine, and that have come to the surface in the past month, more or less, that Russia will defend its border, and it will defend its interests in the Crimea. As for the Russian-speaking population, there are varying accounts as to how many ethnic Russians there are in Ukraine, and they range, depending on who you read, between about 7.5 million and roughly 10 million. So that's a big chunk of a country, which is about 48 million altogether, and a lot of that is concentrated in the Crimea, which, by the way, has a population of about 2 million people, the peninsula itself. So this is a large part of Europe. Sorry?
4.2.
2 million. And
Okay.
just over.
Please stop.
Unit.
Okay.
It's over 2 million, and that's Crimea these days. So, which is still a big part of the country. So for the Russians, the fate of this part of the country is very important. One of the most surprising steps that I saw the new Ukrainian government, or rather the Rada, the parliament, take, is on the first day of its taking power, is voting down the 2012 law on the equivalency of the Russian and Ukrainian language, which is really suicidal from the point of view of keeping the country together, because first of all, of course, it marginalizes the Russian-speaking population, which mostly is concentrated in the east and in the south, and especially in the Crimea. But also, the long-term message is that movement towards the West, towards the EU, somehow excludes and is not in the interests of the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. And if a Ukrainian politician wants to keep this country together, that's the last thing that you want to do as your first step when you're in government. So far, the Russian position, from everything that we have seen over the past 72 hours, has actually been to sit back and wait. Because I think that Putin, who is a very non-emotional, very realpolitik person, is waiting to see what will happen. And I think it's because the Russians know that ultimately Ukraine's real problem is economic. After the passions die down, after whatever government comes to power in Kiev comes to power, the Ukrainians will have to deal with the economy. And the amount of money that this country needs to survive, not only the next 2 years, when the first dues come on their foreign loans, but the next decade, Russia is going to have to be part of one deal or another. If you look at the Financial Times or the Kiev Post for the 21st of November of 2013, you'll find stories there about Putin offering for Kiev, Brussels, and Moscow to sit down and to start negotiating a tripartite agreement to start doing something with Ukraine. 3 months down the road, and after all the blood that's been shed in the center of Kiev, it looks like we're moving back to the position that the Russians had originally offered right on the eve of the summit in Lithuania. So we've come full circle, and now it seems that everyone's waiting, and including the Russians, because they know that economically, and that, again, that is the long-term, most important issue here, the Ukrainians will have to deal with the Russians, and so will the West. So we'll see what happens next.
Yanukovych, were you surprised?
I was surprised. I was surprised, but I was surprised that he fled in the way that he fled.
Mm-hmm.
I suspected that he would relocate to Crimea and try to pull a Taiwan in the KMT situation. In other words, try and say, I'm moving my legitimate government to the part of the country that I can control, and I'm going to get external support from Russia and other countries that would recognize me. But the complete disappearance was a little bit surprising. Now, arguably the reason why it happened was because he had created a regime where people would be loyal to him because the money was flowing their way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different from a regime where people are tied to you on the basis of true loyalty and personal commitment and ideology and are willing to kill and die for you. There was nobody, or there were very few willing to kill and die for Yanukovych. And once they started killing, the regime evaporated, right? So that the oligarchs beneath him, a lot of his own members of the Party of Regents say, we did not sign on for this. And so it's not surprising that the use of extreme violence undermined him. But the nature of his disappearance was a little bit shocking.
And do we know where he is? He's been cited.
He's in Rostov-on-the-Don, or at least we know he will be by tomorrow afternoon, because that's where the press conference is supposed to happen. But let me also tackle this question about Yanukovych. There are several things that are important to consider. First of all, I agree entirely with Keith that politically, de facto, this is a political corpse. There's no way that he's going to come back to power. But there are several issues that are hanging over the country. One of them is that there was no legal procedure to remove him from power, which by the Ukrainian constitution has to be an impeachment process going through the Rada, which then has to be approved by the Supreme and the Constitutional Court. This is what allows him de jure to actually claim that he's still president, because by law he actually is. Number two, he seems to be in Russia, or at least we know that he will be there tomorrow. To the best of our knowledge, he's not in Moscow, and the fact that he's holding a press conference in the south of Russia, close to Ukraine, already communicates the fact that Putin doesn't want him close to Moscow. Publicly, there's no PR to be done around this, because Putin understands how damaging this is. So he's being kept way down south, close to the Ukrainian border. And then there's, of course, the third issue, and I may be anticipating a question of yours, which is the sort of the relationship between Yanukovych and Putin, which counter to the image that's been created in the Western media over the past week or so, and even a month, has not been of a master and a puppet at all. Yanukovych was very unpredictable. He was very unreliable from Moscow's perspective throughout the 4 years of his tenure. And the Putin and Yanukovych were more sparring partners for most of this time, rather than a puppet master and his doll. And the ultimate proof to this is Yanukovych's attempt to play the EU off of Russia, which is what he was trying to pull late last fall going into December, and it backfired disastrously for Yanukovych and ultimately for Ukraine. So I just want to make clear that the situation is a lot more complicated than Moscow and the Cold War vision of the Soviet Union and puppet regimes. Which was not true then, and certainly isn't true now.
Right. Well, he definitely thought he could get a higher price from Europe.
Definitely,
If he
Played hard to get.
Played hard to get.
Yeah.
Yes, it didn't work out very well.
At all.
We are going to go to you guys in a moment, but I want to first ask another set of questions around your thoughts about a future leadership and the potential for future leadership in Ukraine. There were a lot of hopes a decade ago surrounding the Orange Revolution,
Yeah.
and a lot of hopes that Viktor Yushchenko would be a leader that would help eliminate the poor governance and corruption and the problems that Ukraine had faced in the first decade of its post-Soviet independence. And those hopes were dashed. There's a lot of talk now about Yulia Tymoshenko. There's talk about others. What would lead us to believe that there's somebody with great leadership potential who can put this together and move this country forward in a way that did not happen after the Orange Revolution?
So I think that looking for the right leader is part of the problem. And I think we should be looking for the right institutions and trying to work on preserving those institutions. That part of what we saw after the Orange Revolution was a new group comes to power, and they, in many ways, practice the same behavior as the ones that came before. They put their people in the courts. They control the prosecutor's office themselves. They expropriate the wealth of their enemies. And it isn't whether Yulia Tymoshenko is a good or a bad person or not. It's that the institutions were such that she knew those levers very well, and she manipulated them in a way that was not so different from her predecessors. And I think there's a real risk now that if we don't focus on the institutions and instead we focus on which specific member of the Maidan committee is going to be the true, honest Ukrainian founding parent, right? I think we could get into real trouble again. And there hasn't been a focus on those institutions. In fact, there have been widespread violations of anything that looks like rule of law in recent days. You have armed militias going around the country that are being sort of legitimized as paramilitaries that are going to work alongside the police. That's a very dangerous precedent. We haven't seen that go well in any country in the world. And so I think that focusing not on leaders, but on getting good rules and having the international community stabilize those rules and not commit to some sort of quick and easy but somehow morally satisfying victor's justice, where we're going to prosecute all the enemies and purge them. I think that's the real risk right now, is that we'll focus on the personalities and not on the institutions themselves.
And Anton, do you feel that the reaction that the United States, or the policy the United States has had during this crisis has been the right policy? Do you think that there should be other things or different things the United States should be doing?
Jim, it's hard for me to answer for the U.S. Victoria Nuland certainly made her impact on revealing to the world U.S. policy, at least in early February. The State Department is going to have to answer this one. What I will say, following what Keith has mentioned, is that I agree that institutions are important, but never in human history has a revolution been undertaken without a personalized symbol. And that may be a big problem for Ukraine because it doesn't have one. Tymoshenko is fascinating to watch because, boy, is she, talk about an iron lady in politics, that's her, but that's exactly what has tarnished her reputation and led to her loss to Yanukovych. Remember that the 2010 2010 election, which was very, very close, was Tymoshenko against Yanukovych. And so bad was the reputation of the Orange coalition that Yanukovych, with his criminal past, actually squeezed through into the presidential seat because there was so much cynicism in Ukraine about the years 2004 to 2010. Regardless of who actually comes to power, and I can't think of a single figure who is a unifying force right now because they're all scattering in different directions. The bigger problem is that if Ukraine decides to take Western money, especially IMF money, and it won't be able to fix itself without both Western and Russian help, it's going to have to, the next government is going to have to implement austerity measures. And that will make the next government and the next leader very, very unpopular in Ukraine. So again, when all the passion of the immediate acute crisis is over, this country faces some very tough choices going forward. And if I were a really wise Ukrainian politician, I'd be sitting out the next few years and then readying myself for an election down the line. Because the last thing you want to do is get elected now and then have to cut pensions, cut social benefits, and then preside over a country that's unraveling. Part of the problem, let me just add one more thing to the East-West divide. Part of the problem that's very important to remember is that although Ukraine is divided into roughly the East, Southeast, and the West in terms of its geopolitical sort of strategy, and that's an oversimplification as Keith mentioned, it's also economically lopsided because most of the industry and the tax base is actually in the East. And unemployment is a lot lower in eastern Ukraine than it is in western Ukraine. And that makes the East economically more important in Ukraine, but it's the east of Ukraine that also has more of an identity crisis about what it means to be Ukrainian and how closely culturally you are to Russia. The western part of Ukraine is a little more clear about its identity, but the economic base isn't there. And that's also going to be a problem for whoever becomes the next leader. So it's really, there are a lot of issues ahead.
There are a lot of issues ahead, and I want to make sure you guys get a chance to ask your questions, especially if you happen to be in a class in which you have a paper due and you need specific help here and now to work on your paper. I would also ask that you identify yourself and that you make sure that your question is short so that we can get as many people.
We have 30 minutes. Come on.
Each question, if you want to ask a question, it's got to be short. Okay, it can't be a. It can't
Help
be
if it were a question.
It can't be a statement.
I highly appreciate your appearance as always.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm sorry. Julia Belopolsky, professor of Russian in here in AU, and it's not a question.
Well, then I'm sorry. I don't need a statement. Is there a question over here? We'll go. Yeah, I want to hear it. Go ahead. You're not.
I'm going to hear. I'm sorry. Do you know that I'm from Crimea?
We're taking questions.
Hi, my name is Irina. I'm a student.
To ask a question. I'm sorry.
I'm a,
You cannot dismiss me.
I can.
I'm a student here, Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm originally from Ukraine. My question is, from what I've seen as I've been following the crisis, I've seen that the people are very much done with believing that a politician is going to save them because largely of the Orange Revolution and how much hope they put into Yushchenko. So I'm just wondering your perspective on how that's going to play out. I agree with what you said about the fact that institutions have to be reformed and we don't need to look for good leaders but good institutions. So the fact that the people are not looking to a man or a woman to save them, how do you think that affects the politicians and some of their policies and their thinking in terms of restructuring the government? I feel that the governmental leaders are kind of afraid of the people because they've seen what the people are capable of. So do you feel that the fact that the people, are not waiting for a man or woman to save them, that's affecting their structuring of the government and their creation of policy?
And actually what we'll do so we can get as many people in as possible, I'm going to take two at a time. So you remember the first one? And then we'll go to Bill over here, and then I'll come back over this direction.
Hi, Bill Lucas. I teach a course here, but it does involve Ukraine, so I'm eager for instant information. No, I was just wondering, what are the chances that law and order would break down in Ukraine, perhaps marauding militias, perhaps something approaching civil war? And if so, what would Russia's reaction be in that situation? And also, what are the chances that some piece of Ukraine might break away and join Russia?
All right. Back to you guys.
Right. I'll take the second question first. I think the chances of law and order breaking down in Ukraine are very high because it's already happening. We're already seeing it. There were a lot of weapons that were seized early on, and the militias are well armed, and they're refusing to disarm. And so the government has kind of tried to manage this by just incorporating them into the government in quiet ways. But again, we've seen in Indonesia and other cases where incorporating militias into the government or working with them leads to a lot of unaccountability and human rights violations. And I think there's a lot to worry about there. And I think Russia, I agree entirely with Anton on this. Russia does not want to intervene in this case. And Russia would very much prefer that the country not fall into civil war. I do think that if there were an attack of, let's say, central government forces in Kiev that were led by former leaders of Pravy Sektor, or sort of the right-wing nationalist movement, or Samoborona, which was the self-defense forces of the Maidan, I think if that was, say, cracking down on movements in the east that were, sort of a Russophile Maidan in the east, I think Russia might be more encouraged to intervene in that case. And that gets at your other point about, what happens if parts of Ukraine start to move away. And I think it's pretty clear that we're seeing that in Crimea now. I think people will be cool-headed about this. I actually think Russia will. I think the U.S. will. I think the EU will. And I actually think Kiev will. I don't think there's going to be storming of Crimea, for example. I think what we've seen over and over again in Ukraine is that, yes, there are these moments when people don't recognize the central government. And then there's a brief period of time in which what goes on in Kiev doesn't necessarily matter for what goes on in that province. But ultimately, being in Ukraine is typically better than not being in Ukraine for a lot of these provinces. And, nobody wants to see this country fall apart. Sort of the classic, story of Solomon, with the mothers and the baby, and they're trying to determine who it is. Nobody wants to tear apart the baby here. Everybody recognizes the baby has a lot of value, and nobody's going to sever this thing in two. Not the Russians, not us, not the EU. So, I think that makes me happy. Right? I think we can rest somewhat calmly that the country will not entirely be torn apart because there's wisdom, I think, on both sides.
Right. Oh, did you want to speak to hers, or Anton, if you wish to?
Let me tackle. Sorry, what is your name again? Irina. Tackle the question of cynicism. There's a lot of it in Ukraine. And it's not just because of the Orange Coalition, although it also is. And it's especially because of the heightened expectations of 2004, 2005 and their evaporation. It's also, of course, Yanukovych, but it's also Kuchma and even Kravchuk. It's 23 years of a very unstable situation. I think what the Ukraine, this is going to sound very like something you'd hear from a historian. I'm sorry, but Ukraine needs to start thinking of itself, and it needs a politician that stops dragging it east or west. It needs to start developing its national identity not through purity of the Carpathian West Ukrainian type or the Donetsk type, but as a bridge nation, as a nation that can actually profit from being in between two blocs, even though sometimes they act like rivals. No Ukrainian politician has been wise enough to actually do that. I don't see any right now, but it's like sitting in 1789 and trying to predict what's going to happen in France. It's impossible. Maybe someone will come. I think the most important thing right now, and this is not my metaphor, but it's to make sure that the February revolution doesn't turn into an October one by the time we get 6 months from now, because East Europeans know very well the tricks that history can play on revolutionaries that start a process and then lose control over it as more radical and more highly organized and armed elements begin to call the shots. So, we're watching a nation being forged, and sometimes it happens on the barricades. It's going to have to happen in the Rada also. That's all I can say. About the breaking up and the violence, there's been a lot of talk in Ukraine over the past month about a new federalized system of organization. Remember that the Crimea has been an autonomous region, had enjoyed that status. That was cut down a little bit in the 90s, but then it's trying to get back to its autonomous status. We'll see what happens. Perhaps the wisest thing to do is to let the Crimeans have it for now, and then offer them economic incentives to recreate closer ties to Kiev. Everything is ultimately economic. It's a lot sexier to talk about politics. It always is in revolutions. But ultimately, Ukraine's problems are economic. And that's where people's eyes glaze over, because once they start calculating the hryvnias and dollars and what money goes where, that's when everyone will lose interest, and we're all going to be reading about the next scandal or crisis somewhere else in the world. But ultimately it's an economic issue. And so it's the economy that will keep Ukraine together. This is why I think that this is the perfect time for the U.S., Europe, and Russia to come together and start talking economics. And that means that the new government in Ukraine needs to start talking to Moscow. And I think the Russians made a mistake by recalling their ambassador. Zurabov left for consultations in Moscow. It's unclear. Well, the second in command, of course, is in command now, but everyone needs to be engaged. And there shouldn't be a zero-sum game, which is why, again, I don't give the Putin government a lot of credit, but in November of 2013, they offered a sit-down discussion of the future of Ukraine, and the Europeans thought they were going to get away with Yanukovych signing. I think Putin was actually wiser at that time, because he already understood that this man is very difficult to deal with, and he's playing two sides against each other. The Europeans came out somewhat the losers at that particular moment. Hopefully everyone will smart up, sit down, and start talking about hryvnias and dollars and rubles.
All right. Now, I asked them for short questions, so I'm going to ask you for short answers so that I get more of them in. Apparently, there are questions on Twitter. Are you reading those to us? Who's reading the questions?
I have a Twitter question. Hi.
How are you?
This is specifically.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello. My name is Summer Rodriguez. I work in the events office. Does Professor Fedyashin believe that more instability might result in Russian intervention to stabilize Ukraine for gas exports?
And will you ask? Why don't you ask? Are there any others?
No.
We asked two. I'll come back to you later. There was one right here too. We'll go to this question as well. You had a question? Yeah, there are mics right there.
Whenever anything.
Will you introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Timothy. I'm an SAS junior. Whenever anything like this happens, there's always such a rush to establish parallels to any situation, no matter how unfitting the parallel might be. In this case, there's a lot of bandying around of the war with Georgia in 2008. What do you say to people who really don't get the distinction between the two conflicts? What are the parallels, and most importantly, what are the differences?
Great, thank you. So the first one was asked to you, and then I'll let you take it.
Sure, let me tackle that quickly. Instability, as I said, is not in Russia's interest, and I think that the first thing that Putin will want to do is to actually engage with NATO and the UN if Ukraine does begin to descend into a crisis. The last thing that the Russian army needs is to get bogged down in the eastern part of Ukraine or in the Crimea fighting guerrilla war, which is inevitably what this is going to turn into. So the day before the mobilization started on Ukraine's borders, Russian military commanders were on the phone with NATO military commanders talking about, that wasn't released, but they're clearly talking to each other. So I doubt that the Russians are going to be rolling in there. I really do.
Which is a good segue into the parallel or not with Georgia, since the Russians did do that, but there were consequences.
Yeah, there were, and that was also a different situation, which is the Saakashvili government attacked. Right? So it was an effort to reincorporate a de facto autonomous region. And that had some very negative consequences. And I think we might see similar consequences if the government in Kiev stormed the Crimea, for example. If they weren't patient, we might get a negative outcome like that. But I see more parallels to Georgia in 1991, 1992. So you have the risk of having an extreme central government, which alienates lots of regions of the country that leads them to pull back. And you end up with a protracted fragmentation of the state that's really hard to put back together. That's my worry.
Great. There was a woman right behind, yes, you, and then Professor Lohr.
Hello, my name is Katia, and I'm a graduate student at SAS. Now that we have a new government formed in Ukraine, how do you envision the relationship between the European Union and Ukraine developing in the future? Is Ukraine likely to sign the association agreement, or is Europe likely to distance itself from Ukraine due to economic turmoil as well as violent political cultures that we have seen emerged?
Great. Eric?
Eric Lohr, I'm in the history department, teach Russian history. So I'm just wondering about the conflict between stability and legitimacy, and the easy way to get stability quickly is to make deals with local elites in the East and South. But legitimacy depends on fighting corruption. That's the one thing everyone agrees on. But if you fight corruption, how do you make deals with local elites?
The EU.
The EU. Yes. Eric's question's too hard. I'm going to leave that one to Anton, because you're both in the history department.
I'm corrupt and I belong to the elite.
That's right.
Department of AU.
Yeah. With the EU, I don't think they're going to disengage. I think they're going to be more engaged. I'm hoping that they will wait on signing the association agreement until after the elections. I think it's important because of the nature of this transition and because of the sort of the questionable constitutionality of the impeachment of Yanukovych and the sort of scattering and reorganization of parliamentary deputies. I think we need an election to have a government that can take a decision like that on the future course of the country. And I'm hoping that the EU waits for that. But nobody has to wait to do the reforms that would be necessary to make Ukraine more of a fit for Europe. That could happen right away. And I think this government may start doing those things with European advice, support, help. The problem is, it's going to require money in the short term. And as we saw with Greece, the Europeans aren't so keen to throw money at governments that don't have a great reputation for spending it wisely. And this government isn't necessarily, it's not road tested, and it's not clear whether the institutions are already in place for it to handle the influx of billions of euros of funds properly.
Yeah, I think, I would just add with respect to the EU that, and Anton already referred to Assistant Secretary Nuland's remarks that were widely reported, and I'm not going to repeat the quote, but I think that the real downside of that is to engender this notion that the United States doesn't think the EU is really up to the task of taking a leadership role in this situation. And the EU, the EU is what it is. I think a lot of Americans don't really understand the EU very well. The EU is not like the United States. It's not the United States of Europe. There are a set of European institutions, but there are also very strong member states within Europe. We've seen that countries like Poland and Germany and France are very eager to play a leadership role. You also have countries in Europe, like Sweden, for example, that have had a lot of interest, and there have been a lot of ties between parliamentarians in Sweden and efforts to help support democratization in both Ukraine and even Belarus. There's been some very interesting interactions there. So you have countries in the wider region that are interested in what's going on and can play a role, and then you have the European Union as a union that certainly has significant resources, but they are going to be called upon to play a major leadership role, and I think you'll have a lot of people in Europe who want to be able to step up. This is a major test for them. There's no question about it. And if you look at the history of European enlargement into Europe, I always anger my European friends when I say this, but empirically it is correct. The European Union followed NATO's lead in enlarging into Central and Eastern Europe. And the reason that happened was because NATO provided the security and stability and the assurance that those countries would be secure, especially, for example, with the Baltics, enabled the European Union to enlarge as well, primarily on economic grounds. The tricky situation here is you're not going to have that external guarantor of security. Ukraine is not going to be on a path to membership of NATO. There have been those moments previously, but that's not in the cards, and it makes it harder when you're thinking about the relationship that you want to build. What's been so difficult for the EU with the Eastern Partnership is it really requires a different model than the model that was used for enlargement into the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that became European Union members, and that's been very challenging for the European Union to both conceptualize and implement. All right, I gave you guys time to think of your answer to Professor Lohr.
Anton?
Great question. That's Eric. I got, those people who study Eastern Europe over the past 20 years have been dealing with this issue forever. People who have been studying France in the medieval period know what it means for a king to deal with the elites and what it takes. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. If I had an answer, I'd be, I don't know. Well, I wouldn't be in Kiev right now, but I'd be somewhere else.
Okay, I have a partial answer for you.
There you go.
Which is that there are lots of different forms of corruption that take place in Ukraine. And some of the big ones would not require the support of regional oligarchs to resolve. And the biggest one is the system that was created for siphoning money off of gas payments. And that one can be resolved immediately. It was a system that was essentially designed by Pavlo Lazarenko and Yulia Tymoshenko back in the 1990s. And every Ukrainian leader since then has enriched themselves with this system. And it's very simple, which is that instead of making hidden the amount of money that Ukraine actually pays for its gas from Russia and creating a gap between the amount of money that it pays for the gas from Russia and the amount that it sells to Europe and to its population, you close that gap. And then that surplus does not go into offshore accounts, into glorious estates, into a variety of means of personal enrichment at the very top. And really, that will go a very long way towards improving the situation in Ukraine. That's been a really big corrupt line item in the Ukrainian economy for a long time.
Do we have one last question from Twitter?
Yes. How will China, who has invested heavily in Ukraine, react to Russian intervention?
Or not, or just even more broadly, just the situation. I mean, what kind of investments do the Chinese have, and what are they going to be worried about?
The Chinese have a lot of investments in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is pretty much the part of the country where the investments belong, because there's not much to invest in the east. The Chinese, about 2 hours ago, issued a statement about the fact that they do not expect to be dragged into Ukrainian affairs geopolitically, that they believe that the Ukrainian people have to decide, and that they look forward to a productive economic relationship with Ukraine. I think it's in China's interest not to see Russia become involved, but since I don't believe that Russia will become involved, I think that's a moot point. I think everyone's on the same page here.
And can I close by asking you, since it would appear that the external powers all have a strong interest in stability and a unified country, what does that mean for a potential role for the United Nations? We haven't, Ban Ki-moon, there were some statements about a week or so ago from the UN. I haven't seen anything recently. I don't know, maybe there has been something, but I mean, they seem awfully quiet. And on the one hand, you could say, well, that's going to be hard because you've got the permanent members of the Security Council. But on the other hand, if those permanent members really don't want to see civil war and an escalation of the violence, then perhaps there is a role.
I think the UN would get involved to clean up the mess if it gets a lot messier. If it goes the way of the Balkans, for example, then we'll see UN involvement. But I think there's a deference to the OSCE. Like, I think there's a sense that Europe has its own, established structures for resolving these types of things. And I think we'll see a lot more activity along those lines before we see it at the broader UN level.
Great.
I think that'll have to include a reach out by the Europeans to Russia and a willingness from Moscow to sit down at the table. So we'll see how it plays out.
Great. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Really, we so value the fact that you're here at American University to help enlighten us on these issues and all the things that you do in the classroom and elsewhere on campus. And grateful to everybody here for coming and for those who watch the live stream online. Thank you all very much.